flight attendant rips up a black woman's ticket, not knowing she owns the entire airline. At 30,000 feet in the air, the unthinkable happened. A flight attendant ripped up a black woman's ticket in front of a stunned crowd. It seemed like a simple act of arrogance and prejudice, but what no one realized was that this woman wasn't just any passenger. She held a secret that would turn the entire airline upside down. What unfolded next is a tale of power, justice, and the kind of karma you never see coming. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss this. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy heartwarming stories of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support means the world and helps us reach even more people with these powerful stories. Now let's jump right in. Victoria Daniels adjusted her wide-brimmed hat as she stepped into the bustling airport terminal. The air was thick with the chatter of travelers, the hum of announcements, and the hurried steps of passengers rushing to their gates. For most, it was a place of anticipation, of beginnings and reunions. But for Victoria today, it was a test. She gripped her first-class ticket, her nails tapping against the fine paper, and strode toward the counter with quiet confidence. Her outfit was understated yet elegant. Tailored trousers, a silk blouse, and a simple gold necklace that glimmered softly under the fluorescent lights. But Victoria had learned long ago that no amount of elegance could shield her from the assumptions of those who refused to see beyond her skin. As she approached the counter, she noticed the flight attendant immediately. The woman's name tag read Karen Miller, and her expression shifted the moment their eyes met. Victoria could almost hear the unspoken judgment. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered that look, the narrowing of eyes, the tightening of lips, the subtle stiffening of posture that told her she was unwelcome. "Next!" Karen called, her voice clipped. Victoria stepped forward, sliding her ticket across the counter with a polite smile. "Good afternoon. I'd like to check in for Flight 237, first class." Karen's eyes darted to the ticket, then back to Victoria. A condescending smirk crept across her face as she picked up the ticket, holding it as though it might contaminate her perfectly manicured nails. "First class?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "Yes," Victoria replied evenly. She'd dealt with this before, the subtle digs, the attempts to undermine her, but she wouldn't let this woman rattle her. Karen let out a quiet scoff, shaking her head as she tapped a few keys on her keyboard. "This must be some kind of mistake," she muttered, loud enough for Victoria to hear. "First-class tickets don't come cheap, you know." Victoria felt the familiar sting, but she kept her expression neutral. "There's no mistake. Please verify my ticket." Karen tilted her head, her smirk growing wider. "I don't think I need to. This ticket looks suspicious." She held it up for a moment before, in one swift motion, tearing it clean in half. The terminal seemed to grow quieter, though the noise around them hadn't changed. Victoria stared at the shredded pieces of paper in Karen's hand, the act so brazen it momentarily left her speechless. "Now you won't need to worry about any mistakes," Karen said with a mocking smile, dropping the torn ticket into the trash. "You're free to head back to economy, or wherever you actually belong." Victoria's chest tightened, but her face remained composed. The years had taught her the power of restraint, even in the face of blatant disrespect. Slowly she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "I suggest you retrieve my ticket, and while you're at it, call a supervisor." Karen leaned back, crossing her arms. "I don't think that'll be necessary. Security will be here shortly to handle this little misunderstanding." Passengers nearby began to notice the commotion. Whispers spread through the terminal as eyes turned toward the counter. Some pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Victoria straightened, her gaze unflinching. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "If that's how you'd like to handle this, I'll make a call of my own." Karen laughed, a high, mocking sound. "Oh, please, who are you going to call?" "Your manager? Save it. Security's already on their way." Victoria pressed a button on her phone, her voice steady as she spoke into it. "Activate Protocol 1. I need immediate intervention." Karen's laughter faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But before she could say anything, 2 security guards appeared, their presence imposing. Karen regained her smug expression, gesturing toward Victoria. "This woman is causing a disturbance. Please escort her out." The guards turned to Victoria, their expressions unreadable. One of them stepped forward, his hand hovering near her arm. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us." Victoria didn't resist. She simply held her head high, her calm demeanor unwavering as she allowed herself to be escorted away. But as she walked past Karen, she paused, her voice low but laced with quiet authority. "You're going to regret this." Karen's smirk faltered for just a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing her face, but she quickly dismissed it, turning back to her counter as if she'd won. Victoria, however, knew better. This was far from over. Victoria's heels clicked softly against the polished airport tiles as she was led down a quiet corridor by the 2 security guards. The noise of the terminal faded, replaced by the hum of distant ventilation systems. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her back, their movements cautious, as though they were expecting trouble. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol," one of the guards said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was younger, with a closely cropped haircut and the nervous energy of someone new to authority. "We'll get this sorted out soon." Victoria didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to speak just yet, not with the simmering anger coursing through her veins. Her breath was steady, controlled, but her mind raced, replaying the moment Karen had torn up her ticket. The audacity, the cruelty. They reached a small holding room at the end of the corridor. It was sterile and sparsely furnished, with a table and a few chairs. A camera perched in the corner blinked red, its lens fixed on the center of the room. The guards gestured for Victoria to sit, but she chose to remain standing, her presence filling the room despite its starkness. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. "If you could just wait here." "I've waited long enough," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She turned to the older guard, who had remained silent. His face was weathered, his posture rigid. "Do you understand the gravity of what's just happened?" The older guard hesitated. "Ma'am, we're just here to ensure things don't escalate." "Escalate?" Victoria let out a low, incredulous laugh. "Do you think I caused this escalation? Did you not see the way your staff treated me out there?" The younger guard opened his mouth to respond, but the older one raised a hand to silence him. "We don't want any trouble, ma'am." "Trouble?" Victoria took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Trouble has already arrived, and let me be clear, it's not coming from me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The younger guard looked away, guilt flickering across his face. The older one, however, held his ground, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Before either of them could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. It opened to reveal a man in a tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression tight with urgency. He exuded authority, the kind that silenced rooms and commanded attention. "Ms. Daniels," he said, his tone respectful but brisk. "I apologize for the delay." The guards exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the man's demeanor. Victoria turned to him, her expression softening ever so slightly. "You're late," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge that spoke of her expectations. The man inclined his head. "There were complications, but I assure you, everything is being addressed as we speak." Victoria nodded and gestured toward the guards. "These gentlemen thought it appropriate to escort me here without explanation. Perhaps you'd like to enlighten them." The man's gaze shifted to the guards, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Gentlemen, do you have any idea who you've just detained?" The older guard cleared his throat, his bravado from earlier quickly fading. "We were just following orders. There was a report of a disturbance." "A report?" the man interrupted, his tone sharp. You mean you took the word of an incompetent employee over verifying the facts? The younger guard looked down, visibly shrinking under the weight of the man's words. The older one remained silent, his jaw tightening. Victoria crossed her arms, her presence commanding. Perhaps it's time we get back to the counter. I'm curious to see how Miss Miller reacts when she learns the truth. The man nodded. Of course, Miss. Daniels, I'll personally ensure this matter is resolved. As they left the room, the guards trailing behind, Victoria's pace was unhurried, her heels clicking steadily against the floor. Her calm demeanor was not a sign of submission, but of control. Every step she took carried purpose, each click a reminder that she was far from defeated. When they re-entered the terminal, the atmosphere seemed different. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they recognized her return, flanked by the suited man and the two subdued guards. Karen, still stationed at the counter, looked up from her clipboard. Her smug expression faltered at the sight of Victoria, her eyes darting nervously between her and the man in the suit. "Miss Miller," the man said, his voice carrying across the terminal. "We need to have a word." Karen's posture stiffened, her confidence visibly wavering. I was just doing my job," she stammered, her tone defensive. "Doing your job?" Victoria said, her voice calm but cutting. "Is that what you call tearing up a passenger's ticket and accusing them of fraud without proof?" Karen's face turned red as passengers around them began murmuring, their phones once again raised to record the scene. She opened her mouth to respond, but the man in the suit held up a hand. "Enough," he said firmly. "Ms. Miller, your actions today have not only embarrassed this airline, but have also endangered your position." Karen's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. I didn't know who she was," she blurted out, the words spilling from her lips in desperation. Victoria stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "And what difference would that have made? Would you have treated me with respect if you had?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the murmurs of the growing crowd. Victoria glanced at the man in the suit. "Proceed." He nodded and turned to Karen. "You're relieved of your duties effective immediately. Security will escort you off the premises." Karen's face crumpled, her confidence shattered. "Please, I didn't mean—" "Save it," Victoria said, her voice icy. "You didn't mean to be caught. That's the only thing you regret." As Karen was led away, Victoria turned her attention back to the man in the suit. "This isn't over. I expect a full review of your staff and protocols." "Of course, Ms. Daniels," he said. "You have my word." Victoria nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to catch." And with that, she walked toward the gate, her head held high, leaving behind a room that would never forget the lesson she had delivered. The quiet hum of the first-class cabin greeted Victoria as she stepped aboard the plane. The flight attendant stationed at the door, a young man with a polite smile, straightened his posture as he saw her approach. He had clearly been informed of her identity. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, but he managed to keep his expression professional. "Welcome aboard, Miss Daniels," he said, his voice slightly strained. "Please allow me to escort you to your seat." Victoria offered a curt nod, her gaze scanning the cabin. She wasn't looking for comfort. She already knew the first-class amenities by heart. Instead, she was searching for something far more important, the reactions of the crew, how they composed themselves, whether their smiles were genuine or forced, and whether their respect came from obligation or understanding. The attendant led her to a plush seat by the window, its leather gleaming under the soft cabin lights. He gestured to the space, bowing slightly. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." "I'm sure I won't," Victoria replied, settling into her seat. Her movements were measured, deliberate. Every gesture spoke of control, a quiet assertion of her authority that required no words. As the attendant retreated, Victoria's phone buzzed softly in her hand. She glanced at the screen, an incoming message from her assistant. Protocol 1 initiated. Full report pending. CEO en route to terminal. Victoria's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. The wheels were already in motion. What had transpired at the counter was just the beginning. Karen Miller's actions weren't an isolated incident. They were symptomatic of a much deeper issue, one Victoria had been determined to address for years. The boarding process continued, the faint murmur of passengers filling the cabin as they took their seats. Victoria watched them, her mind piecing together fragments of the day. Her demeanor was calm, but beneath the surface, her thoughts swirled with quiet intensity. Moments later, a woman in a crisp uniform approached her seat. She had the poised walk of someone in charge, but her hesitation betrayed her. This was the purser, Victoria realized, the lead flight attendant for this journey. Ms. Daniels, the purser began, her voice careful, as though testing the waters. I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience you experienced earlier. Victoria studied the woman's face for a moment before speaking. An inconvenience, she repeated, her tone steady but pointed. I believe what happened was far more than that. The purser's cheeks flushed. Of course, you're absolutely right. What happened was unacceptable. I assure you that steps are being taken to address the matter. Victoria leaned back in her seat, her gaze unwavering. Steps? Tell me, what does that entail? A slap on the wrist for an employee who thought it acceptable to tear up a ticket and humiliate a passenger? The purser faltered, the confidence she'd tried to project crumbling under Victoria's scrutiny. I can't speak to the specific measures being taken, but I assure you— Assurances, Victoria interrupted, her voice still calm, but with an edge that cut through the purser's words. Do you think assurances are enough, that words alone can undo what was done today? The purser looked down, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her blazer. No, ma'am, they're not, but I promise you we're taking this seriously. Victoria allowed the silence to stretch between them, the weight of it pressing down on the purser. Finally, she spoke, her tone softer but no less firm. Good, because what happened today is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a culture that tolerates ignorance and prejudice, and that's something I will not stand for. The purser nodded, her expression a mix of shame and determination. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll do better. You will, Victoria said simply, because I'll make sure of it. As the purser retreated, Victoria's attention turned to the window. The view outside was a patchwork of runways and blinking lights, a world in constant motion. She watched the ground crew bustling below, their fluorescent vests glowing in the evening light. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. She glanced at the screen, CEO Alex Grant. With a swipe of her finger, she answered. Alex, she said, her voice calm. I trust you're handling things. Victoria, came the voice on the other end, deep and steady. I'm at the terminal now. I've reviewed the footage. It's worse than I thought. I expected it would be, Victoria replied. And Karen Miller is being terminated effective immediately, Alex said. We're also conducting a full audit of our training programs and protocols. This isn't just about her. It's about making sure this never happens again. Victoria nodded, even though Alex couldn't see her. Good, but this isn't just about training, Alex. It's about accountability. The culture needs to change, from the ground up. I understand, Alex said. There was a pause, and then he added, Thank you for bringing this to my attention. It's easy to miss these things when you're not on the front lines. That's why I'm here, Victoria said, to see what's really happening and to make sure our airline lives up to its promises. As the call ended, Victoria leaned back in her seat, her gaze returning to the window. The plane's engines roared to life, the vibrations thrumming through the cabin. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. This was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, but for now, she would let the plane carry her forward, knowing that justice had been set in motion and that she had the power to ensure it continued. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane taxied toward the runway. The faint vibration of the engines beneath the floor hummed like a distant storm, steady and unrelenting. Victoria sat upright, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Though her exterior remained calm, her mind was anything but. She glanced out the window as the plane's wings sliced through the evening mist. In the distance, the orange glow of the setting sun painted streaks of fire across the horizon. It was a tranquil scene, yet it did little to soothe the turmoil brewing within her. The murmurs of passengers settling into their seats filled the cabin. Somewhere behind her someone coughed, the sound sharp against the low hum of activity. The purser reappeared briefly, walking briskly down the aisle, her eyes avoiding Victoria's as she passed. Victoria caught the hesitation in her step and the nervous way she clutched the edge of her clipboard. Victoria turned her gaze back to the window. It wasn't fear she wanted from them. What use was fear without understanding? What she wanted was recognition, the kind that came with lasting change, not temporary regret. Her hands tightened on the armrests. Change took time. It required patience, strength, and an unyielding resolve to demand better from those who resisted it. As the plane lifted off the ground, the cabin fell into a subdued quiet. The city lights below blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors, growing fainter with each passing second. Victoria exhaled slowly, her mind drifting back to the events of the day. She had been in airports countless times, had walked through terminals in cities across the globe. Yet the experience was rarely different. It wasn't the overt hostility that cut the deepest. It was the small, insidious acts. The way people hesitated when they saw her in line, the way their eyes flicked over her, searching for something that didn't belong. The way their smiles tightened, their voices sharpened, as though her presence demanded an explanation they weren't prepared to hear. The memory of Karen's sneer flashed through her mind. The sound of the ticket tearing, the deliberate cruelty of it, had echoed louder in her ears than the bustling terminal around her. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the confidence Karen had carried, the certainty that there would be no consequences. That certainty had been her mistake. A soft knock on her armrest pulled Victoria from her thoughts. She turned to see the young flight attendant who had greeted her earlier. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his nervous smile faltering as their eyes met. "Ms. Daniels," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to check if there's anything I can get you." Victoria studied him for a moment. His uniform was immaculate, but there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, and his shoulders were slightly hunched, as though bracing for reprimand. She could see the fear in his eyes, not fear of her, but of what she represented, accountability. "Water would be fine," she said finally, her tone measured. He nodded quickly and disappeared down the aisle, returning moments later with a glass of chilled water on a silver tray. He placed it carefully on her tray table, his hands trembling slightly. Victoria watched him, noting the way his eyes flickered toward her, then away. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer this time. The young man nodded and retreated, his posture stiff. Victoria took a sip of the water, the coolness refreshing against the warmth of her frustration. She set the glass down and leaned back, letting her gaze wander across the cabin. An hour into the flight, the purser returned, this time with a tray of refreshments. She approached cautiously, her steps deliberate, her expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Daniels," she said, her voice steady but lacking the warmth one might expect in first class. "I've brought you our selection of hors d'oeuvres. I hope it's to your liking." Victoria glanced at the tray. "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but distant. She reached for the small plate of smoked salmon and dill, setting it down on her table. The purser lingered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Victoria looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Is there something else?" The purser hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the tray. "I wanted to apologize again. I know words might not mean much, but I truly regret what happened earlier." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying the woman. "Do you regret the incident itself, or the fact that it involved me?" The purser's face flushed, her composure slipping. I regret that it happened at all, she stammered. It was wrong, and I should have stepped in sooner. Victoria nodded slowly. That's a start. The purser opened her mouth as if to say more, but Victoria held up a hand. Let me be clear, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. This isn't just about an apology. It's about creating an environment where something like this doesn't happen again, to me or to anyone else. The purser nodded, her grip on the tray tightening. I understand. Do you? Victoria asked, her gaze piercing. Because understanding means more than just acknowledging what went wrong. It means committing to change, even when it's uncomfortable. The purser's eyes dropped to the floor. I'll do my best. That's all I ask, Victoria said, her tone softening. But remember, your best should never be limited by what's easy. The purser nodded again and turned to leave, her steps slower, more deliberate. Victoria watched her go, a small flicker of hope sparking in her chest. Perhaps this was a lesson that would stick, not just for Karen Miller, but for everyone who had been complicit in their silence. The flight continued in relative quiet, the cabin lights dimming further as passengers drifted into their own thoughts or conversations. Victoria leaned her head against the window, the cool glass grounding her as she stared into the inky blackness outside. Somewhere far below, the world carried on, oblivious to the battles fought in silence and in plain view. Victoria closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to think. The day's events had been exhausting, but they were necessary. Change wasn't easy, it never was. But if she had to face every Karen Miller, every judgmental glance, every dismissive sneer to ensure that others didn't, she would. Because in the end, this wasn't just about her. It was about the world she wanted to leave behind, the one she was determined to build, one battle at a time. The cabin was awash in the soft, golden glow of reading lights. A faint hum of conversation drifted through the air, mingling with the steady drone of the engines. Victoria had just set her empty glass back onto the tray table when the young flight attendant reappeared. His steps were tentative, his expression carefully measured. "Miss Daniels," he said softly, leaning slightly to avoid disturbing other passengers. "Mr. Grant has requested to speak with you. He'll be boarding the plane shortly." Victoria's eyebrows lifted slightly. Alex Grant, the CEO of the airline, rarely appeared in such a direct capacity. His involvement was typically relegated to boardrooms and carefully curated press conferences. That he was coming personally meant he understood the gravity of the situation. "Very well," she said, her tone calm but pointed. "Let him know I'll be waiting." The attendant nodded quickly and retreated, his steps hurried. Victoria leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of the tray table as she gazed out the window. The dark expanse of sky stretched endlessly before her, stars faintly visible beyond the curvature of the glass. She allowed herself a small, wry smile. Alex's visit was a step in the right direction, but she wouldn't let it overshadow the larger issue. Minutes later, the quiet of the cabin was interrupted by the faint shuffle of movement at the front of the plane. A figure appeared, tall, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. Alex Grant carried himself with the confidence of a man used to control, yet as he approached Victoria's seat, there was a faint tension in his posture, a sign that he knew this meeting would not be simple. "Victoria," he greeted her, his voice low and steady. "Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you." She gestured to the seat across from her, a silent invitation. "Alex," she replied, "I trust you understand the seriousness of what's happened today." He nodded, lowering himself into the seat. The leather creaked faintly under his weight. "I do. I've reviewed the footage, spoken to the staff involved, and begun outlining immediate measures to address this. What you experienced was unacceptable, and for that I personally apologize." Victoria studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Unacceptable isn't strong enough a word, Alex. What happened wasn't just an act of ignorance, it was deliberate. Karen Miller didn't act out of confusion or lack of understanding. She acted out of prejudice, fueled by a culture that allowed her to feel justified. Alex exhaled slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You're right," he admitted, "and that's why we're not stopping at her termination. We're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, effective immediately. We're also introducing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, with clear consequences outlined for anyone who violates it." Victoria tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "That's a start, but policies alone won't change attitudes. Culture takes time to shift, and it requires accountability at every level." "I agree," Alex said, leaning forward slightly. "That's why I'm here, to ensure you know this isn't just a PR response. I'm committed to making real changes." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She could see the sincerity in Alex's expression, but sincerity wasn't enough. "Good intentions mean little without action. What about the passengers who witnessed what happened? Have they been addressed? Do they know this airline doesn't condone such behavior?" Alex hesitated, his brow furrowing. "We've begun drafting a statement, but—" "Drafting a statement?" Victoria interrupted, her tone sharp. "This isn't the time for careful wording, Alex. People saw what happened. They recorded it. If you don't control the narrative, someone else will, and their version won't include your so-called commitment to change." Alex nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "You're right. I'll ensure the statement is released tonight. It will include a formal apology and a clear outline of the steps we're taking." Victoria leaned back, her expression softening slightly. "Good. But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated as less than because of their appearance, their background, or the assumptions of others. If you want this airline to represent equality and respect, you need to prove it." Alex met her gaze, his own steady. "I will. You have my word." The conversation shifted then, moving from immediate actions to long-term plans. Victoria listened carefully as Alex outlined his vision for transforming the airline's culture, interjecting when necessary to ensure her points were heard. Their words wove together a tapestry of ideas, some ambitious, others practical, all necessary. As the plane soared through the night sky, the tension between them eased, replaced by a shared determination. By the time Alex rose to leave, there was a sense of mutual understanding, though the weight of responsibility remained heavy. "Thank you for your time, Victoria," Alex said as he stood, "and for holding us accountable." "Don't thank me yet," she replied, her tone lighter but still firm. "The real work is just beginning." Alex nodded and turned to leave, his steps purposeful as he moved toward the front of the cabin. Victoria watched him go, her mind already racing ahead to the next steps. Change, she knew, wasn't linear. It was messy, full of setbacks and unexpected challenges. But it was necessary. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of stillness. The low hum of the engines seemed almost soothing now, a reminder of the journey still ahead. When she opened her eyes again, the stars outside the window seemed brighter, their light piercing through the darkness. Justice wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about creating a world where such battles didn't need to be fought, and Victoria was prepared to fight for that world, one step at a time. The hours stretched on as the plane soared through the night, the cabin settling into a quiet rhythm. Passengers who had earlier watched Victoria with curiosity now seemed to avert their gazes, unsure whether to approach or retreat into the safety of their own worlds. It was the kind of silence she had grown used to, the type that followed a confrontation where people recognized their complicity but were unsure how to act. Victoria leaned her head against the cool window, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the armrest. Outside, the vast darkness was interrupted only by faint pinpricks of light from distant stars. It reminded her of the silence after a storm, calm but heavy with the knowledge of what had been uprooted. She wasn't one for dwelling on the past, but tonight her mind wandered. Memories surfaced unbidden, sharp and vivid. The first time she had boarded a plane as a young girl, clutching her mother's hand tightly as they navigated the bustling terminal. Her mother's whispered warnings to stay close, stay quiet. The way the flight attendants had looked at them, curious, dismissive, unsure if they belonged. Belonging. It was a word Victoria had wrestled with her entire life. She had learned to carve out spaces for herself, to demand inclusion in places that weren't built for her. But no matter how high she climbed, the walls of prejudice seemed to follow, their shadow stretching long and unyielding. A soft knock on the tray table pulled her from her thoughts. The young flight attendant stood there again, his face pale but earnest. He held a small envelope in his hand, its edges crisp and unmarked. "Miss Daniels," he said quietly, "the purser asked me to deliver this to you." Victoria accepted the envelope without a word, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied it. The attendant lingered for a moment, shifting awkwardly. "Is there something else?" she asked, her tone neutral but not unkind. He hesitated, then spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier, and not just because it was wrong, but because I didn't do anything to stop it. I saw what was happening and I should have stepped in." Victoria tilted her head, regarding him carefully. There was a sincerity in his voice that caught her attention, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "What's your name?" she asked. "David," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "David," she repeated, the name rolling slowly off her tongue. "You're right. You should have stepped in. Silence makes you complicit." His face flushed, and he nodded quickly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. "I know, and I'll do better. I promise." Victoria held his gaze for a moment longer before giving a small nod. "Good. Promises mean nothing without action. Make sure your words count." David nodded again, his posture straightening slightly as he retreated down the aisle. Victoria turned her attention back to the envelope, carefully sliding her finger under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the airline's logo embossed at the top. It was a formal apology, likely drafted in haste but earnest in tone. Still, it wasn't enough. A letter couldn't undo years of systemic issues. She folded the paper neatly and set it aside. Words were a beginning, but they were never the end. The hours passed slowly, the darkness outside gradually softening to a muted grey as dawn approached. The cabin remained quiet, passengers either asleep or lost in their own thoughts. Victoria, however, stayed awake, her mind restless. When the purser returned, her face was carefully composed, though her eyes carried the weight of sleeplessness. She stood a few feet away, hesitant as if unsure whether to approach. Victoria gave her a small nod, silently inviting her closer. "Ms. Daniels," the purser began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I wanted to check if there's anything more we can do for you." Victoria considered her words carefully before responding. "What's your name?" "Catherine," the purser replied, her hands clasping the edges of her uniform jacket. "Catherine," Victoria said, her tone deliberate. "Let me ask you something. When you saw what was happening at the terminal, what went through your mind?" Catherine's face reddened slightly, and she shifted her weight. I thought it was wrong, but I wasn't sure if it was my place to step in." "And why is that?" Victoria pressed, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't want to make things worse," Catherine admitted, her voice faltering. "I thought maybe it wasn't my role to interfere." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but not harsh. "Let me tell you something, Catherine. Injustice doesn't care about roles or titles. It thrives in silence and inaction. Every time you hesitate, every time you choose not to act, you allow it to grow." Catherine's shoulders sagged, and she nodded slowly. "You're right. I should have done more." "It's not too late," Victoria said, her tone softening slightly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with recognizing your responsibility and choosing to act, even when it's uncomfortable." Catherine nodded again, her eyes glistening faintly. "Thank you, Mrs. Daniels. I'll remember that." Victoria leaned back, her gaze following Catherine as she walked away. It wasn't just Karen Miller who needed to change. It was everyone who had stood by, everyone who had allowed the status quo to persist because it was easier than challenging it. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, bathing the cabin in a warm, golden light, Victoria allowed herself a rare moment of hope. The road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but progress was possible, and if she had to fight every step of the way to ensure a better future, she would, because justice, true justice, was worth every battle. The plane glided smoothly through the pale morning sky, sunlight streaming through the windows and casting delicate patterns on the polished cabin walls. The once muted hum of the engines now felt harmonious, a quiet companion to the contemplative silence surrounding Victoria. The world outside seemed vast, endless, and indifferent, a stark contrast to the tension and emotion that had colored her journey so far. She sipped the last of her water, the glass cool against her fingers, and set it back on the tray table with a soft clink. Her mind was heavy with thoughts, each one branching into another like an intricate web. The apology letter, the strained expressions of the crew, Alex's promises, none of it could undo the harm of what had happened. And yet, they were small steps forward, whispers of a tide beginning to turn. The quiet was broken by a knock on the edge of her tray table. Victoria looked up to find Alex Grant standing there again, his demeanor less composed than it had been earlier. He wasn't unkempt, he was too polished for that, but there was a tension in his features that suggested exhaustion. "Victoria," he began, his voice softer now, less rehearsed, "do you have a moment?" She nodded, gesturing to the seat across from her. Alex lowered himself into it with a faint sigh, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table between them. For a moment he didn't speak, his gaze fixed on some point just beyond her shoulder. "I've been thinking about what you said," he finally began, his voice low but steady. "About how this isn't just about one employee or even one incident, it's about the culture we've allowed to persist." Victoria tilted her head slightly, watching him. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Alex met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and something else, perhaps guilt. "I've already started. The statement you suggested is being finalized as we speak. It will be released within the hour, along with an announcement about the changes we're implementing, mandatory bias training, regular reviews of staff conduct, and clearer policies on accountability." She listened, her expression unreadable. "That's a start," she said after a pause. "But it's not enough." "I know," Alex admitted, leaning back slightly. "And that's why I'm here. I want to hear from you, your perspective, your experiences. You've clearly dealt with this far too often, and I need to understand what it will take to fix this, not just on paper, but in practice." Victoria studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you asking for my insight as a passenger or as the owner of the airline?" Alex blinked, the question catching him off guard. "Both," he said after a moment, his tone earnest. "But more than that, as someone who understands what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this kind of behavior." She leaned back, her fingers steepled under her chin. "It will take more than policies, Alex. It will take courage. The kind of courage that makes people uncomfortable. You'll have to challenge biases, confront resistance, and commit to change even when it's inconvenient." "I'm prepared for that," he said, his voice firm. "Are you?" she countered. "Because change doesn't come without cost. There will be backlash. People will resist, make excuses, even threaten to leave. You'll lose some employees, maybe even some customers. Are you ready for that?" Alex's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "If that's what it takes to make this airline what it should be, then yes." Victoria's gaze softened slightly, and she gave a small nod. "Good. Then start by listening. Not just to me, but to your employees, your passengers, everyone who's been affected by this culture. You can't fix what you don't fully understand." Their conversation was interrupted by the purser, Catherine, who approached hesitantly, holding a small tablet. "Excuse me, Missy Daniels, Mr. Grant," she said, her voice careful. "I thought you'd want to see this." Victoria raised an eyebrow as Catherine handed her the tablet. The screen displayed a draft of the airline's public statement. The language was clear, the tone contrite, but there was something about it that felt incomplete. She read it twice, her expression neutral, before passing it to Alex. "It's a good start," she said, "but it's missing something." Alex frowned, scrolling through the statement. "What?" "Accountability," she said simply. "It talks about change, but it doesn't acknowledge the harm that's already been done. You need to take ownership, not just as an airline, but as a leader." Alex nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the tablet. "You're right. I'll have them revise it." As the plane began its descent, the world below came into view, a sprawling patchwork of fields and cities bathed in the soft light of morning. Victoria's thoughts turned toward what lay ahead. She had no illusions that the events of the past day would be a catalyst for immediate sweeping change. But they were a beginning, a crack in the foundation of something that had stood unchallenged for too long. When the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted in the faint hum of activity as passengers prepared to disembark. Victoria remained seated, her movements unhurried as she gathered her belongings. Alex lingered nearby, his expression thoughtful. "Victoria," he said as she stood, his voice quieter now, "thank you for your patience, your insight, and your willingness to call us out. I won't forget it." She met his gaze, her own steady. "Don't thank me yet, Alex. Words are easy. Action is what matters." With that, she stepped into the aisle, her presence commanding even in the midst of the bustling passengers. As she walked toward the exit, the whispers followed her, a mix of curiosity and admiration. But Victoria paid them no mind. Her focus was on the future, the battles still to be fought, and the world she was determined to help shape. Justice wasn't just about holding people accountable. It was about building something better. And for Victoria Daniels, the work was only beginning. The terminal was already alive with activity when Victoria stepped off the plane. The crisp morning light filtered through the expansive glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Around her, passengers bustled past, their voices blending into an indistinct hum. But for Victoria, everything seemed quieter, more deliberate, as if the weight of the day had slowed time itself. Alex Grant walked a few paces behind her, his phone pressed to his ear as he issued commands to his team. He caught up with her as they neared the VIP lounge, his pace quickening to match hers. "Victoria," he called, his tone laced with urgency. "Before you go, I'd like to formally introduce you to the team handling this initiative. They're eager to hear your perspective." Victoria paused, turning to face him. Her expression was calm, yet there was an undeniable edge of authority in her gaze. "Alex," she began, her voice measured, "this can't just be a meeting for optics. If you're serious about change, it has to start with action, not just discussions." Alex nodded, his face set with determination. "I understand. This isn't about appearances. I want your involvement at every step, if you're willing." She studied him for a moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, she gave a small nod. "Very well, but I'll warn you now, this won't be easy. Change never is." "I'm ready," Alex replied firmly. The meeting was held in a private conference room adjacent to the lounge. The team, composed of senior executives and diversity officers, stood as Victoria entered, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and respect. She took her seat at the head of the table, her presence commanding the room without effort. As the discussion began, Victoria listened intently, her eyes sharp as she absorbed every word. The executives detailed their proposed plans, new training modules, policy revisions, and mechanisms for reporting misconduct. It was a solid foundation, but Victoria saw the gaps immediately. "This is a good start," she said after they finished, her voice steady but firm. "But it's not enough. Training alone won't change attitudes. You need to create an environment where accountability is embedded in the culture." One executive, a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed beard, cleared his throat. "Ms. Daniels, with all due respect, cultural change takes time. We can't expect results overnight." Victoria fixed him with a piercing stare. "You're right, it does take time, but that's not an excuse for inaction. Every day you delay, more people are harmed. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to undo the damage." The room fell silent, her words hanging heavily in the air. Alex broke the tension, his tone resolute. "Victoria's right. We need to act decisively. Let's prioritize implementing these changes immediately and review our progress regularly." Victoria leaned back slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And remember, this isn't just about policies. It's about people. Listen to your employees, empower them to speak out. Show them that their voices matter." As the meeting concluded, Victoria stepped outside to find David, the young flight attendant, waiting nervously near the lounge entrance. He straightened as she approached, his hands fumbling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Daniels," he began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you for what you said earlier. It made me think about how I can do better." Victoria regarded him for a moment, her expression softening. "David, the fact that you're willing to reflect and learn is a step in the right direction. But don't stop there. Use your position to make a difference, no matter how small it might seem." He nodded earnestly, his eyes glistening with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I will." With a small smile, Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder briefly before continuing toward the exit. The sunlight was warm against her face as she stepped outside, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of jet fuel and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe. She paused at the curb, taking a moment to breathe deeply and let the events of the past day settle in her mind. Her driver approached, opening the door of the sleek black car waiting for her. As she slid into the back seat, she pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. The airline's official statement had been released, and as she read through it, a sense of cautious optimism stirred within her. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The car began to move, the city unfolding around her in a blur of motion and light. Victoria gazed out the window, her mind already turning to the challenges ahead. She knew this victory, small as it was, would not be the last battle she'd face. But for now, it was enough to know that she had made a difference, that her voice had been heard. Weeks later, the airline unveiled its new diversity and inclusion initiatives, accompanied by a powerful campaign highlighting its commitment to equity and respect. The story of what had transpired on Victoria's flight became a catalyst for broader conversations about systemic bias in the industry. Victoria watched from the sidelines, her role deliberately understated. This wasn't about her, it was about creating a world where no one else would have to fight the same battles. And as she read the messages flooding in from employees, passengers, and even competitors inspired by the changes, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and Victoria Daniels was ready to keep walking. And just like that, justice was served, proving that standing up against prejudice and fighting for what's right can create real change. This story reminds us all of the power of resilience and the importance of accountability in every aspect of life. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss another story like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.